Hello, everyone. We're live with Kamil Gregor rocking the "By the way, Christianity is true" shirt.
Yeah, I normally only wear it during sex. This is an exception.
Okay.
So what are we doing?
So we're responding to two top historical scholars prove that Jesus rose. It's Gary Habermas and Michael Coe.
Awesome.
All right, I'm gonna share screen.
Are you going to start at the beginning, or should we skip their cries of false skepticism?
Let's start at the beginning.
All right.
Let's do 1.5 times speed.
Belief. That's what I do on my channel. And today I have two scholars, two of the top two historical scholars in the world on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And
He managed to find two different scholars. That's crazy.
Them on my channel today to share with you guys their testimonies, their stories, because both of these guys have really interesting stories, their interactions with the evidence. Gary was an agnostic, I believe, for a period as well. And I don't know if, Mike, you would qualify yourself as an agnostic, but both of you guys went through a period of doubt, and you came on the other side of it after you went and looked into the evidence as deeply as you have, and we're going to discuss that evidence that you guys found. And yeah, let's get into it. So why don't we take about 60 seconds, Gary, tell everyone who you are, if they don't know who you are, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, I'm Gary Habermas, Liberty University. I've been here for 39 years, believe it or not. And
wow, old.
I'm chair of the philosophy department, and my full-time teaching position is in the PhD program. So I love it because our students are very advanced, and I just love, if you're gonna have good information, you want to go to good people who can use it in ministry, and that's what I'm excited about. And then I'm involved in this for 6 years now. Just past the 6-year mark on this huge resurrection project. It's just a little under 5,000 pages right now. So that's my life.
Awesome.
And I'm quarantined.
Yeah. Right now, if you're watching this in the future, however long.
I mean, like 6,000 pages in like 5 years. That is pretty impressive. That is a lot of pages.
Yeah.
It must be correct.
Yeah, the more. And imagine at some point there will be probably over 100,000 manuscripts of those 5,000 pages. So that's going to make it even more true.
Yeah.
In the future, we don't know how long this thing is going to last, but we're all under quarantine right now, so to speak. Maybe when you're saying quarantine, you're saying like it's a legitimate stay in place, can't get out of your house. We're dealing with the coronavirus right now, so we're all pretty much just stuck in our houses, all going crazy. Well, anyways, let's. So, Mike, tell everyone a little bit about your story, or who you are.
Yeah, I'm a former student of Gary Habermas, and if it had not been for him, I'm almost certain I wouldn't be a Christian today. So I just owe him.
Damn, Gary Habermas goofed.
Everything. He's just amazing. And very much looking forward to his magnum opus on the resurrection. I know he likes my book right now, but boy, when his comes out, it's going to make my book look like the Reader's Digest version. I teach at Houston Baptist University and teach New Testament and apologetics there, and love it at HBU. So yeah, I'm 58 years old, and so Gary and I co-authored a book years ago on the resurrection, and then I have a large book on it that is a slightly revised version of my doctoral dissertation. And then shortly after I got my PhD, which was about, 11 years ago, I began more studies in the Gospels, and since then have been working on gospel differences and gospel reliability, those matters.
Well, I really appreciate you guys coming onto the channel. Gary, we had our in-person interview a couple years ago, and it was amazing. We posted it up, and right now it's just...
Yeah, I think maybe we could have skipped this part, as you suggested.
Yeah, and also, we are going to probably skip about 15 minutes. And they just talk about their personal testimony and about like their some periods of doubt that they had. And I think it's really important to comment on it at least a little bit, because especially given how Cameron framed it initially, the audience might came out of it thinking that, oh, they just look at the evidence dispassionately and objectively, and they concluded that Jesus was probably raised because the case is just so goddamn strong and the evidence is so overwhelming. And I think it's worth reading a short couple of sentences from Lycona's book, where he says, "I confess that in my previous research was conducted more in the interest of confirming my faith and for use in apologetic presentation than being an open investigation in which I would follow the evidence where it led me. I have been able to experience what I believe was a neutral position for a number of brief periods. During these, I have been so uncertain of what I believe in terms of Jesus' resurrection, that I prayed for God's guidance and continued patience if the Christianity I was doubting is true. I also confess that each of those occasions of neutrality did not continue for longer than 2 months, and that it was not usually reasoning that brought me out of it. It was not usually reasoning that brought him out of it. Since I was saving the weight of the hypotheses for the final chapter, but instead it was a lack of conscious and subsisted effort on my part to be in a position as close as neutral as possible. So yeah, like imagine people talking about talking like this when it comes to any other topic than religion. Like imagine if there were physicists discussing different interpretations of quantum physics, and they just ask God for guidance when it comes to which interpretation is true. And just like the comments under the video are also foretelling. For at least for me, the top comment, the one that shows first, says, the first time I heard Gary Habermas, I wept. He was answering all the questions the proponents of the Copenhagen interpretation were throwing at me. I felt like I could breathe again. Yeah, like, again, imagine if this kind of language was being used by in any other topic, by any other people than Christian apologists and theists when it comes to these theological claims. And, this is why it's so important for them to continually talk about how everyone has biases and nobody is perfectly objective, because they are basically being relativistic. If you agree that, okay, maybe I'm not 100% objective, then it makes it look like you are as biased as they are. But I think it's not just a question of whether people have biases, but also what's the nature of the biases and how strong they are. Like it could probably be the case that I'm incentivized to conclude that Christianity is not true, given like my upbringing and cultural background. But I would measure my bias at like 2 out of 10, and these guys are probably at about 15 in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. All right. So, yeah.
Well, I became a Christian at the age of 10, and I didn't grow too much spiritually during my teen years. I was planning on becoming a professional jazz musician. I played saxophone, and I was looking at a university like Towson University. I lived in Towson, Maryland. They had a good jazz program. And my parents, they would watch the Old Time Gospel Hour with Jerry Falwell on Sunday evenings. And
I think you can
they
skip,
found out about a college weekend.
For like 5 minutes. I think they start talking about it at about 2021, something like that.
Yeah, to quote Capturing Christ. Wait, actually, to quote Capturing Christianity or Capturing Christianity Evidence or Psychology. Wait, what? Where is it? Wait, okay. This here. Wait, let me find it. This makes sense in context. Okay. Okay, here.
I'm less interested in a person's psychology as I am interested in the arguments that they have in support of their beliefs, and whether or not I have good arguments in support of my beliefs. Is this a good reason to believe that God exists? Is it not a sufficient reason to believe that God exists? Are there problems with it? That's what I care most about. That's what I want to know.
Okay. So yeah, that's why we're skipping this. Because we're not interested in the psychology. We want the evidence.
And so I ended up calling Gary. There was no email back then, so I called him. And I'd bug him, and so he'd refer me to books, and I'd buy books, and I'd read these books, and I'd ask him questions. And that's how I got involved in apologetics. And then just to wrap this up, later on, after...
Look, I mean, I was having doubts about the many worlds interpretation. I was thinking Copenhagen might be correct. So I called Gary. There was an email back then. He referred me to books.
Gary and I wrote our book, and we're finishing that. I think we were wrapping it up at the end of 2002. I said, all these different scholars that you're aware of, and they look at the same data and they arrive at different conclusions. Who are these scholars? And he said, well, most of them are New Testament scholars, few philosophers. I said, well, any historians? If this is a historical question, are any historians doing this? And he said, yeah, a few. He said maybe a handful of historians have tackled the question of Jesus' resurrection or written on it. And I think the most that a professional or general historian had written on it was Paul Meyer in a very small book. And, I was looking for something that would, Paul Meyer's a great guy too, I love him. I was looking for something though that was, really exhaustive, and what were the tools that historians
worth
use?
Commenting. So it's definitely true that you won't find many books written by professional historians on the topic of whether Jesus was raised from the dead, and sometimes Christians perceive it as evidence of weakness of the opposing side, right? They think, oh, if it's really so obvious that Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, where are all the peer-reviewed books arguing that he wasn't? Well, it turns out to be the case that professional historians have better things to do than basically arguing about witches, right? Like if I'm studying classics on the university level, and if I applied for a grant, and my proposal was I'm going to research whether Jesus was raised from the dead or not, the grant committee would laugh me out of the room. They would tell me to get back to my work and count international trade of ceramic lamps in the 1st century between Gaul and Syria, which is the kind of research that professional historians of antiquity are actually doing. The only people who are interested, pretty much the only people who are interested in these kinds of debates are professional apologists who are extremely well funded by established institutions that have motivation to promote Christian faith, and a very small, underfunded community of skeptics who more or less than not are like very peculiar personality types. Normal, well-adjusted people just do research in other areas because they think that it's so obvious that Jesus probably wasn't raised from the dead, right? That they just don't write 5,000 pages volumes about it on the topic.
It's the naturalistic bias in academia, Kamil. The only reason that they don't believe in implausible claims about miracles is because they have the naturalistic bias.
Well, at least if that's the case, at least they are consistent, because they don't write books about how it's not the case that like cows were giving birth to human babies in Rome in during the Second Punic War and stuff like that. There are supernatural claims outside the Bible in ancient literature, and what professional historians and scholars in these relevant areas are not doing are trying to work out naturalistic explanations for why these claims are made. They just understand that there are reasons why, and in some cases identifiable reasons, why those kinds of claims are found in the text. They are just not interested in combating them, right? Or debunking them. Skeptics do that sometimes, but there is no. It's not the case that there is this landscape of parity between the two opposing sides, and the fact that one of the two sides, Christian apologetics, is producing more content is like evidence that they have better arguments. It's like with Jesus mythicism, right? It's the case that there haven't been peer-reviewed publications arguing specifically for the proposition that Jesus existed as a historical person, but it's because it's basically taken for granted, right? So of course you're not going to write books arguing for it. You're not going to write books arguing that the Roman Empire probably existed, right? Not that those are comparable claims in terms of epistemic credences. It's just what explains the absence of that kind of literature.
Wait, but isn't your credence in Jesus mythicism like 30% or something? Or
yeah,
maybe
it is.
Okay, so it's not that fringe of a view if you're.
It is a fringe view when it comes to how many scholars think it's over 50%. But it's not like overwhelmingly improbable when it comes to the epistemic credences. It's not comparable to the claim that the Roman Empire existed. That wasn't the point, right? It's just what explains why there isn't a debate about it. Why pretty much the only content that's being put forward is by people who argue for only one side, which is like what is the case when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus as well.
Okay. All right, let's continue.
And nobody had done that up to that point. So I thought, well, I'll do it, and I'll prove the resurrection from a different angle. But as I got into my research, I found that philosophers of history are unanimous in saying there's no such thing as an objective or completely open-minded or neutral historian. Everybody has their biases, and these biases and agendas jeopardize the integrity of the research. And I thought, well, that's me. I have my own biases here, my own agenda in proving the resurrection.
I heard about how biased the historians were, and I thought, that's me. I am biased.
Yeah, because all of the historians who think that Jesus probably wasn't raised, they are so biased that they are like crying and weeping when they think about it, right? So yeah, we all have biases, and our biases are exactly of the same nature and exactly of the same magnitude. Just like when you discuss bias in economics, I don't know, an economist who's teaching in Chicago is exactly as biased as the chairman of the communist country of China when it comes to evaluating Marxism, right? They have exactly the same kind of bias, just in the opposite direction. It's not the case that one is like institutionally incentivized. And also, it's not the case that one attaches overwhelming importance of that one particular belief in their worldview because he thinks there are like eternal consequences to it. That can't be the case.
Right? It's a metaphysical absurdity.
Direction. So by nature, I found I'm a second guesser. I just second guess everything. And it's just the way I'm wired, not just my worldview, but whether I married the right girl.
You second guess your second guessing? Checkmate, theist. You say that you can't be certain of anything. Are you certain of that?
Whether I bought the right watch, the right car, the right house, and I just second guess and triple guess. And if you're going to do it with small things like a watch, much more, your worldview, because eternity could hang into balance with it, depending on which religion is true. So,
this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about, right? So if you assign this kind of overwhelming importance to the question, that doesn't make you more objective. It makes you less objective. It makes you less inclined to conclude it's false because of what you currently believe. You currently believe that if you do conclude it's false, you're going to fucking burn forever. This is what I'm talking about, right? So come on, like, what are you talking about? And that he often repeats during the debates and during the lectures that he gives that he's a second guesser. And I think this is a typical cry of false skepticism. This is to motivate your audience into thinking, oh, he's a second guesser, and he concluded that the resurrection probably happened. So if a habitual second guesser concluded that, then it must mean there's probably really good evidence, right? Because he would just second guess it so much that he would conclude atheism or not Christianity. But we just read a quote where he asked God for guidance when he was doubting Christianity, and he explicitly says that it wasn't reasoning that led him out of it. And I'm sorry, it's just the case that Christianity is the kind of religion where practicing it means engaging in behavior that reinforces your bias. If you want to really be objective and neutral as much as possible, and you want to remove as many biases as possible, then you would just have to disengage from practicing the religion that you believe in. You would, for example, have to stop going to church. Because when you go to church and when you sing hymns and you repeat creeds, those are techniques that are in place to reinforce your existing biases. That's just true. Like, sorry, it sucks to suck, but that's just what it is, right? So what are you talking about? You're a second guesser.
Yeah, it's sort of... James Fodor talked about this in his book, about a common literary motif being the disavowal of prior skepticism. So, like, in the Gospel, they talked about how the disciples were, like, very skeptical, but then Jesus had to walk around for, like, days in order to convince the disciples. And so, yeah, I think that is kind of perhaps at play here, too.
And to be fair, I can imagine that, I don't know, like non-theists probably do that as well. For example, when an atheist tells you that, oh, I wasn't studying to become a minister, and then I discovered that Christianity is false, that could be the same kind of rhetoric, right? So that they were actually in a position to be able to better assess whether the religion is true or not, and they just concluded that it's probably not. So that could be this kind of symmetry in some cases.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Do the best I personally could at managing my own bias and agenda. So I was studying the philosophy of history, historical method, and articulated 6 steps.
Honestly, my history back, my like theism backstory is like super lame. I was just never a theist. Theism always seemed absurd to me, so I don't have the disavow of prior skepticism. I need to convert for like a week and then like deconvert and then talk about my big deconversion story. Now it was just based on the evidence, like how I had this really powerful religious experience. But then I plugged all the problem view onto a Bayes sheet, and I realized that it had more power than my religious experience.
Yeah, I happen to be born in a country which has been measured to be one of the least theistic countries in the world. So not even, and it's been like that for about 70 years already. So not even my grandparents are theists, right? And the people who are theists here, you wouldn't know it, you wouldn't recognize it until it shows up in conversation. Like a religion basically exists, but it's pretty much completely invisible in society.
Or you would recognize them by their shirts, like, by the way.
Yeah, there are no, well, there is like one street preacher in the entire country. He will be in the busiest square of the in the capital right now, and it's probably because it's Easter. Yeah, here churches are basically just historical monuments. They are mostly empty, and like 90 years old women are going to congregate there on Sunday, and that's pretty much it.
Well,
steps that I took to manage my bias while my investigation proceeded. And so whereas in grad school, writing a 20-page double-spaced paper with a few footnotes was a real chore for me and something I did not want to do, my doctoral dissertation ended up being more than 500 pages single-spaced and more than 2,000 footnotes. I just became obsessed with it.
What kind of PhD professional talks about whether his PhD thesis was single-spaced or double-spaced? Like, this is getting absurd, right? And there is this argument that the point of apologetics is not necessarily to provide compelling arguments and evidence. It's just to basically gum up the machine, right? It's just the content is there not to be read. The content is there only to be pointed to. So it's not actually, you're not just supposed to assess the evidence. You are just supposed to point to it and say, unless you read all of that and you engaged with the best arguments and best evidence and you read all the thousands and thousands of pages, you are not justified in leaving the faith, or you're not justified in not joining it. And I think this is a piece of evidence, like really strong piece of evidence in favor of that view, because it basically takes it to an absurd extreme. Not only is he talking about how many pages his PhD thesis has, he talks about how many citations there are, and also that it was a single space or not double spaced. Like, it's literally about how much content he produced and not about the merit. That really makes me, because normal people don't talk about like that, right? Like when they give out Nobel Peace Prizes or not Nobel Prizes in like physics and medicine, they don't talk about whether the papers were single spaced or double spaced. They reward the merit. Normal people don't discuss their academic publications in these kinds of terms. Then they don't even talk about how often they were cited or how many publications they wrote, right?
Well, no, I mean, each publication that you cite increases the probability that your thesis is correct. Look, it's a cumulative case from all the citations.
So, but at the end of the day, I could say, hey, I did look at this with integrity. And, of course, we can't prove Jesus' resurrection with 100% certainty, but I do think that we can have a great deal of confidence that it occurred, it's not only plausible, but it's very likely that it occurred. So you asked for books. The book, my slightly revised doctoral dissertation, Gary mentioned, it's like 700 and some pages. This is it. And that was translated into 2 different languages last year.
Can we skip like 2 minutes?
What?
Can we skip like 2 minutes?
Yeah. Well, no, it was translated. The more languages it got translated into, the more true it became. Yeah.
All right.
Look, I mean, independent confirmation. You had the Greek copy said the same things. Undesigned coincidences in the text between the different Lacona books in different languages.
3 arguments for something. Now, your mind can kind of wander, but if you have 3 arguments for God's existence, 3 arguments for the resurrection, 3 arguments for an afterlife, reliability in the New Testament, if you have 3 arguments, and here's the key, they're all independent. They don't rely on the other ones. One could be false, and one.
They're independent, and they don't rely on the other ones. Wow, powerful.
No, I think he just explained what independent means in this context. Right? Let's not be assholes.
You have 3 arguments, say reliability in the New Testament, and they don't overlap. And each one, if you were to put it into probabilities, and historians aren't crazy about that, but more and more are doing it. And if you put that into a percentage, so you have 3 arguments, and here's the setup. If you have 3 arguments for something, and each one is at least 80% reliable. 3 arguments, independent, 80% reliable. The likelihood that one of them is true is about 99%. So I think that's kind of stunning. When we say probability and the listener goes, oh no, just probability, understand that probability goes all the way up to 99.99999. In 380s, you can put any combination you want, 290.
Yeah, we don't want just probability. We want certainty for our theological arguments.
No,
I think it's sort of funny that he's like worried about his readers being like disappointed about the like limited efficacy of probability. But he's like, but you can have probabilities be close to 100%. I don't know. It's kind of ridiculous.
No, I mean he's essentially talking about like some Christians are legitimately anxious. They feel anxiety when you tell them that history only reaches probabilistic conclusions and that you can't be certain, right? So he's essentially countering that anxiety by saying, sure, it's only probabilistic, but the probabilities can be very high. We can get to a very high degree of certainty.
Yeah.
Two 80s and a 70, where you'd put it there. Now, it's a little bit subjective for you to say what you think the percentage is, but you can get in the high 90s just by probability calculus. So just those points. Yeah, if I were to make a case for the resurrection,
you don't even need Jesus. You just need probability calculus.
Cameron, I would take way less than 5 minutes if somebody said, yeah, give me what you have. In 1 or 2 sentences, I would say the argument I like to use, which I call the minimal facts argument. I can tell you sometime how I got doing that, but I started doing this when I went through my period of doubt. And the question I asked was, if critics
also if you have 100 arguments for atheism, which is out there, so it's only enough if they are each like 1%. If each has like 1% probability of being true or being sound, because then the probability that at least one of them is sound and therefore atheism is true is overwhelming, right? That's also how it works.
I think that I saw the Capturing Christianity stream that was 150 plus arguments for God, and they were really reaching with some of those arguments. Like the arguments obviously double counted the evidence, and a lot of them were just like garbage. And you contrast that with the one by Fodor and Nathan, that was the 500 arguments against God. And I thought that most of the 500 arguments against God were good.
I think most of them were really bad. Like, come on. I think there were like 5 good arguments, and I would actually say, yeah, like it's more probable than not. But or at least you can
of the arguments against God. No, yeah. So obviously the like quadruple counting of them was cheating.
But sure, like if you take it out,
yeah, but there were lots of arguments that I thought were pretty good. Like,
I should say at least it could be just apologists are living in my head rent free so much that for a lot of those arguments I could immediately come up with how they would counter it.
Yeah, I found a lot of the biblical ones, for example, to be pretty persuasive. I found most of them to either be like most of the ones that were not parodies of theist arguments to be pretty persuasive.
I think a big problem for me is with the idea that of like predictability of God's intentions. Like, what is it that we would really expect if a deity existed? And it got both. I am just like very uncertain that we are able to establish that, which obviously counts both against arguments for theism, but also arguments against theism, right? So if there's like some kind of premise in terms of if God existed, this would be the case, then I'm just being very skeptical of that argument is sound, because I just don't feel we are in a position to estimate it.
But Christians will ascribe to God particular desires, like that we follow the New Testament.
Sure, yeah. I reject that as well, right? It's just it works against both positions.
Right. But so it's an internal critique. It's like it's an argument as to why a God who wants us to read the New Testament doesn't exist. It's like just to take one example of an argument, like the argument from biblical length. Well, that argument was a little bit silly, but I don't know. I mean, I think that the Bible is just so massive that like no one reads it. It seems like you would expect God to make his holy book like readable. Like there are like a gazillion books, and the Talmud is even more unreadable.
Yeah, I have my pet argument that I have to write a book on at some point, and it's the argument from Greek. It would be like if God existed, he wouldn't reveal his revelation wouldn't be communicated in Greek. It is communicated in Greek, therefore God doesn't exist. And the motivation for the first premise would be just all of the features of ancient Greek, which makes it particularly unfit for communication. Like there are so many peculiarities about grammar and semantics and stuff like that make it that make the meaning obscure and unclear and ambiguous and stuff like that, which is perfectly predicted on the hypothesis that this is just people writing stuff, people who have like limited ability to estimate in advance and like apprehend all of the different possible interpretations of the text, and that's why the text is ambiguous. But it becomes really unlikely that this is the way how a deity intended to deliver his revelation. Like, for example, in present and perfect verbal stem, medium, middle, and passive voice have the same form. And there are legitimate theological disagreements in Christianity that has been lasting for like centuries, which are just parasitic on this ambiguity. That, for example, you cannot say, based on the text alone, whether in certain specific passages in Acts, the followers of Christianity were saved, or whether they saved themselves, because in the Greek, it's undistinguishable. And it would be like a cumulative case, because there are so many different features. One of them is, for example, Unitarianism versus Trinitarianism. Because the reason why Unitarians can consistently interpret the entire New Testament is fundamentally due to some ambiguities of the Greek language, which make it unclear whether, for example, in the introduction of the Gospel of John, Jesus is identified with the God, Yahweh, the creator of the universe, or whether he's just a divine being.
Yeah, one argument that I find, this is sort of my original. I like your argument from Greek. I'm making a list of. I'm trying to get to 1,000 arguments against God, but I'm not triple counting, so I'm not.
Well, you can definitely put the argument from Greek there. I think it's perfectly legit argument.
Yeah, no, I think that's an above average argument on my list of 1,000 arguments. But one argument, my sort of pet argument, is what I call the problem of maximization. So the argument is like, so what we would expect from an omnipotent being, the type of universe they would generate, would be one that's optimizing for their goals, just given that, beings in general optimize for their goals. And so if we think of agents with basically any plausible set of desires, the universe would be just sort of just sort of very simple and optimized for one thing. So for example, suppose God were a utilitarian. Well, then the universe would just be like infinite happiness. Or if God was like a virtue ethicist, the universe would just be infinite, maximally virtuous beings or something. And so the fact that the universe is just not really optimized for anything, much like we can rule out the existence of a paperclip maximizing God on the basis of the universe not being pure paperclips. Seems like when we can rule out the existence of a God with any simple set of aims based on the existence of the universe not being optimized for a particular thing.
Yeah, I think there is an interesting symmetry in that, for example, when theists discuss the fine-tuning argument, they say that on naturalism, what's predicted is that the vast majority of possible worlds would be devoid of life. And if that was the case, that would be evidence for naturalism. And I'm just thinking, well, that's exactly what's true about the actual world, right? The universe that we currently observe is mostly devoid of life. So isn't that what we would also expect on naturalism? Isn't the fact that the universe is clearly not optimized for life, isn't that evidence against there being a god who like desires to create life? Yeah. But again, like I'm just very skeptical of these arguments because I don't think there's like a very rigorous way how to estimate what a deity would intend to do, and that's just but even that itself is like makes theism problematic because I think that points to a god being a really shitty explanation in general because it's so underinformed, right? It lacks specificity, basically.
Yeah, I think that the best way of defending theism would be to defend a kind of radical form of skeptical theism, where you say that we just can't really know what God would do.
Yeah, but that is just a completely vapid explanation.
Well,
right?
well,
I think that's
well, no,
actually one of the worst forms of theism. Because
so what you do is you say we can't know what God would do, but then you just appeal to the improbability of things on naturalism. So you say, like, the odds of fine-tuning are like 1 in 10 to the power of 50 or something on naturalism. And so even if we have no idea what God would do, and so we should assign a really, really small probability to God creating a finely tuned universe. It's just lower. It's just even lower on theism. And then you go more with the sort of like deductive arguments from like contingency and stuff and limits. I mean, I don't think those arguments end up being successful, but I think that the arguments that sort of try to get to God a priori, and then you take away the evidentialist challenge by just saying we can't really know what God would do. That I think is the best route. But
all right, well, let's talk about the resurrection.
Oh yeah, we got completely sidetracked.
This thing in the Gospels didn't happen, and that thing in the Gospels didn't happen. Oh, I can't use that text. That one didn't happen. This one, and I wrote a statement at that time. I was in college. I was later in college, and I wrote a personal statement saying the Bible wasn't inspired. My own statement. And
Giga Chad, Gary Habermas.
So if I'm going to reject this
in college,
this, and this, here's my question: is there enough to say the resurrection still occurred? And so then I made the next step. Okay. I'm going to use Rudolf Bultmann, who was the hot critic at that time. I put him easily to the left of Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman makes concessions that Rudolf Bultmann would never make. And I said, okay, can I use Rudolf Bultmann or David Strauss, if you want a 19th century guy who's just like Bultmann? If I use their data, can I get a resurrection? Their data. So in other words, would an unreliable New Testament stop me? And here's the argument. One sentence. I can use the facts that the most critical scholars, and that's the key, they've got to be a scholar with a terminal degree in a relevant field. If I can use the facts which relevant scholars, critical scholars, I can go care if they're atheists. If I can use their facts and get to the resurrection, to me, that's the strongest possible argument for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, Mike and I, we're in different...
The strongest possible argument? There's no stronger possible one? What if Jesus appeared to everyone? What? That would be much...
And also, Bultmann was a Christian. Let's also keep it in mind, right? When these apologists are constructing the tribes in their tribalistic framework, they are, for example, constructing the category of the skeptic, which is like the enemy of the one true faith. But let's be fucking real. Like, an overwhelming majority of New Testament scholars have always been Christians, including the ones, for example, who argue that the resurrection didn't happen because miracles don't happen. There are almost no non-Christians in New Testament studies. So all of the guys that he's going to cite as skeptics were just as pious and just as sincere in their commitment to the Christian faith as he is.
Yeah, one thing that I think is sort of interesting, and this is one of the things that I find sort of fun about the historical evidence, is there's sort of like a meta game to it. So to see like how much of it they agree with. So like how much of the Christian history they'll agree with, and how much of it they'll dispute. So someone like Carrier, I would say, would be like way over on the left side, using Ehrman's categorization. Carrier thinks that there's like no evidence that Jesus even, he thinks that the evidence doesn't favor Jesus even existing. So he would just dispute every one of Gary Habermas's minimal facts.
That being said, I think there is a horseshoe theory of biblical studies. So if you actually construct the left-right spectrum of these positions, then I think it tends to bend. And I think that like extreme mythicists are often, I would say probably even more extreme than Carrier, right? Like the people who think that the Gospels are like modeled on astronomy and the zodiac and stuff like that. I tend to find out, and I need to systematically start gathering evidence for it, that they, like, the way how they think about it, and some of the positions that they take are basically identical to evangelical scholars. Like, for example, it's very often the case that these kinds of people just can't imagine how a Galilean peasant would become identified with the creator of the universe in a monotheistic religion. And they think, well, it just can't be the case that he was just a guy and this is what happened to him. So either it's actually metaphysically true that he was the creator and that's how he became identified, or he was just an entirely fictional character, So yeah. And also you can play the same game of how much history you take on board with people on the right. So I often, when I listen to apologetics, particularly when I listen to apologists who are not trained in these relevant fields, it's really interesting to suss out how much of critical scholarship they are okay with. Like, for example, J. Warner Wallace thinks that the synoptic problem doesn't exist. He thinks that the three synoptic gospels were written independently from each other. That's fucking nuts, right? Nobody thinks that. There are people who argue for Matthean priority. They argue for the Gospel of Matthew being written in Hebrew or Aramaic originally. There are people who think it was written by the tax collector, but no scholar thinks that they were written independently, as in Matthew didn't know that Mark existed or didn't read the text before. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's like interesting to see the different ways of defending it. So you have someone like Carrier on the right, and on the left, I would say someone sort of like Fodor, where Fodor basically just grants all the minimal facts, but then just including the empty tomb, but then just has a naturalistic account of the empty tomb.
I think that that's the difference between how much you're willing to grant for the sake of argument and how much you honestly believe, like sincerely believe, right? Because I think Fodor wouldn't say the probability that Jesus was buried the way how it is described in the gospel is actually above 50%, like historically speaking. He just grants it for the sake of argument. And even Carrier, when he debated, I think William Lane Craig or other people, like what I think he did like 2 debates since he became a mythicist on the resurrection of Jesus. And he just says at the beginning, I'm going to grant for the sake of argument that, like a historical Jesus, because it's disadvantageous for him to argue for mythicism in a debate about the resurrection, because it's just such a big can of worms, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But I don't know. And I think of Ehrman as being sort of somewhere in the middle, where Ehrman will grant more of it. Though I'm pretty sure that Fodor did say. I mean, no offense to Fodor, but they are sort of in different categories. Like Richard Carrier, and Carrier and Ehrman obviously like are much more qualified in the field of history than Fodor is. Though Fodor is still quite qualified. But yeah, I don't know. I just sort of like find the division in my head to be kind of interesting. Like I like the sort of different strategies.
Yeah. I would say James Fodor is not qualified at all, right? Because I actually put a really high stock in formal academic qualifications, just because of like what's happening with the internet culture and how it relativizes knowledge and expertise and stuff like that. I'm not formally qualified to talk about this either, because I haven't got any formal academic degree, even though I know know more facts and have like more pieces of information contained in my galaxy-sized brain than a vast majority of practicing Christians, right? But when it comes to qualifications, no, I'm definitely not qualified.
Well,
that's
I
just-
would
that's just
say, I mean,
nitpicking.
I would say that Fedor is somewhat qualified in that he's written a book, a decent, like, with
Yeah.
like 50 pages or something dedicated to the subject.
Is it
laying out
double
his-
spaced or single spaced though?
Oh yeah, no, true. No, and how many footnotes? But yeah.
Context. We use different numbers of facts. I don't know what number he is now. He did 3 in his dissertation. Then at the end of his dissertation, he brought some others in and said, I think these maybe should be admitted into the group too. So we play around with how many other facts are there. But right now I'm using 6, and I could do them real quickly. And the percentage of scholars who are going to agree to this are in the 90-something percentile. And when you say, well, how do you know that?
Citation fucking needed, right? So this is a massive problem with Habermas. And it's and not just Habermas, but Habermas is a particularly egregious example of this, where apologists are, and not just apologists, by the way. So I should say people in general are going to make claims about what's consensus in a particular field, like New Testament studies or biblical studies, and even with percentages of scholars subscribe to it, but they provide no evidence for those claims. It's just their feelings. And Habermas is a particular egregious example because he actually has a peer-reviewed paper out where he says that 70% of all scholars find, since like 65 or 1975, find at least one argument for the existence of the empty tomb has a force. But he doesn't actually provide any evidence. He claims that he went through all of the publications and he counted it, but he never released the actual data. So we don't know who he counted. We don't know who he considers to be a critical scholar. We don't know whether he limited it to only publications written in English, for example, whether he also counts all the amazing Italian scholars, also his statement is often misconstrued. Apologists say that it's actually the case that 75% of New Testament scholars are convinced that the empty tomb existed, which is, of course, very, very different from the actual claim that he makes. So hopefully, at least 1,000 pages out of that 5,000 massive tomb that's about to be published anytime soon is going to be him actually providing the primary data for the claims that he's been making for like 15 years now.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Yeah. And the other thing is like, so I mean, I would say that my current credence in an empty tomb is like below 50% probably.
Yeah, in my case as well.
Yeah, but I would say my credence in Jesus having existed certainly would be above 50%. But if it turned out, if you told me that one of the following 2 things were true, either Jesus didn't exist or he was raised from the dead, I would assign way higher credence to him having not existed than having been raised from the dead. And I would assign way higher credence to like
exactly. And this is how you date mythicist chicks when you are a historicist, right? This is how you get in, right? So that's the one thing that we can all agree on, that Jesus' mythicism is astronomically more probable than his resurrection. I'm sorry, but
Right, I would find the twin hypothesis that says that Jesus had a secret twin to be more probable than the resurrection.
Yeah.
I would even find the alien hypothesis to be more probable than the resurrection. Though I mean that's getting a little bit close, but so like, even if we grant that the historical consensus, like if most historians are like 55% that the empty tomb happened, but they think that if the empty tomb happened, or like that the evidence, like they think that you can that even if the consensus leans slightly towards there having been an empty tomb, that's not gospel. And so, well, I guess it is gospel, technically. But so to the extent that we have enough evidence to, I'm explaining this very poorly, but the broad point is just that even if the consensus is that X is the case, the consensus is that X is the case is not conditional on Gary Habermas's extra analysis, thinking that if the empty tomb happened, Jesus didn't exist. So if the evidence pointed towards an empty tomb, I would be perfectly happy to grant an empty tomb. I don't think it does. But if the evidence pointed to both an empty tomb and solid evidence that if there was an empty tomb, then Jesus was resurrected, well, then I would reject the empty tomb, because I would think that exactly. I would do a Morean shift.
Exactly. And I just want to say, when it comes to these extreme alternative explanations, let's just say the dichotomy is that Yahweh raised Jesus, the one Messiah, as a vindication of his messiahship and sonship and stuff like that. Or Christianity is a result of a satanic deception that Yahweh allows for morally sufficient reason. Then I think the second explanation is way more probable, just because it better fits the religious milieu of ancient Judaism, right? There are no a priori reasons for thinking that Yahweh would be interested in raising, first of all, in having the Messiah be crucified as a criminal and then raising him from the dead. If you were a Jew living 10 years before Jesus was born, you wouldn't conclude that there's no reason to believe it. But it's the case that in that religious milieu, there is the adversary, the accuser, right? And it's really, really plausible that he would be interested in deceiving people into worshipping a human as a god, and therefore breaking the first commandment, right? That's way more plausible given the background theology of where the religion came from. So that's also, I think, more probable.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one hypothesis that I obviously don't think that this is true, but I think that this is something that should be considered more. So, Stephen Law has talked about the evil God hypothesis. I like the trickster God hypothesis, where the being is, or James Fodor has talked about a cohort of fairies who are going around doing things. And, that would explain inconsistent revelations. It would explain weird, inconsistent miracle claims of different religions. It would explain fine-tuning and such. It explains evil, divine hiddenness. So that just seems like a way better explanation than God. And yet that's still a terrible explanation. And so terrible explanations are way better than God. Well, God is a very bad explanation.
But here's the 6. Jesus died by crucifixion. The disciples had...
Okay, 1. Wait, let's write these down. Jesus.
I have a list of minimal facts lists, because different apologies give different ones. I can also pull it up.
Okay, so what's your credence that Jesus died by crucifixion?
Oh, are you going to do the Bayesian thing?
Yeah.
I don't know, pretty high, 70%.
Okay, so I'd probably, that seems like about where I'd be at. Okay, 0.7. Okay.
Experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Barterman says it's absolutely...
Okay, so how many people believe that they saw? Yeah, I think this is underspecified, because we would have to talk about what exactly is meant by it. Because let's be real, what Gary Habermas is imagining in his head when he says that is that there were people in the first century who were sincerely convinced that the resurrected Jesus was living with them for a period of 40 days, and that he was having meals with them, that they touched him, that they had prolonged conversations and things like that. I don't believe there were people in the first century who had these kinds of experiences. If we had a time machine, we wouldn't be able to find anyone like that. I think the reason why the Book of Acts says that these kinds of experiences happened to people is because it's historical fiction. And that's overwhelmingly more probable than that those kinds of people actually existed.
Okay, so would you say the odds of that are of the post-death appearances the way that Habermas describes?
So what's the probability that we could find people in the first century that we could interview that would describe that they sincerely believe they experience the kinds of things that are described in the post-resurrection appearances narratives in the canonical Gospels, I think the evidence, the probability of that is like astronomically low, essentially, even on naturalism.
Look, we're entering it into the Bayes sheet. So actually, the Bayes sheet is currently a thing I'm writing on a piece of paper. I don't have a spreadsheet,
Right.
sadly. So what odds would you give? You have to give a number.
Do I have to give a number?
Yes,
It's
the Bayes rule.
It's a limit of like 0, basically. It's approaching 0 to
How about
like the maximal degree.
How about 0.0001? Is that
sure?
Fair?
Yeah, we can tweak it later. You have to. I think with these kinds of really low events, we would have to, or hypotheses, we would need to find like actual documented events that have a really low probability, and then compare our epistemic credences. So, what's the probability that you are going to be hit by lightning at some point in your future life? Like, that surely must be pretty low. But I still think that hypothesis is more probable than the thing that we are talking about.
Well, so I mean, to the extent, yeah. So my credence. Well, okay. Let's make it easier on the apologists. Let's make it so that it's very minimal appearances. So we don't know the nature of the post-resurrection appearances.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's just like they had some visions of something.
Okay. Let's just say that in the 1st century, relatively shortly after Jesus died, and we are not talking like 3 days later, we are talking up to, 3 years later, there were individuals and groups who just went through such strong religious experiences, similar to religious experiences that people have in like group settings today when they worship in various religions, that they became convinced that Jesus is present with them, and they used the language of seeing Jesus to describe it, even though no actual visual perception was involved. They were just describing their purely internal psychological state of like experiencing very intensive feelings, essentially, induced by a religious context, that they felt it's appropriate for them to talk about it in terms of seeing Jesus.
Yeah,
I think that's pretty. It's pretty probable.
So conditionalizing on Jesus' death by crucifixion, what odds would you give to that?
I think it's over 50%. I don't know how much. How do you say that?
Well, look, I mean, we got it as per the Dutch book arguments. You got to assign probabilities. Like 60% would be reasonable.
It could even be less than 50%, to be honest. Like, it could be really low, right? Even conditional on the probability that Jesus died.
So what number do we want to put in?
I'm not sure. Like, you go first.
Here, I'd say 60%.
What's the so it's conditional on Jesus dying? Is it also conditional on us being aware of the evidence as it exists now?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so then it's very high. Let's say it's like 90%.
90%. Wait, why?
Well, because if you conditionalize it on us having the evidence that we currently have, then I think like the texts us having texts that describe people, Jesus appearing to people, makes it more probable. Because I just think that's one of the possible explanations for those texts existing. Like for example, if we didn't have any texts, then I would assign a lower probability to that happening.
Yeah, okay, that's reasonable. Okay, so 0.9. All right, let's hear the third fact.
It's proven by history. Okay, they had experienced it. They believe there isn't Jesus. It was proclaimed very early. You know, when I first started doing this, Cameron, they put that date. Critics would put that date and say maybe Paul.
Critics. Gotta keep saying it. You don't like me saying it.
Christians, in other words, other Christians,
Yeah.
right, who go to church, who confess, who pray, who ask for forgiveness. People
Yeah,
like
I'm not
you.
sure if
Got it.
Oh, sorry. I'm not sure if we're on the third fact or the second one.
Yeah, it's the third fact.
Okay.
It's
In
the early
Jerusalem, plus
proclamation.
5 years after the cross. We are way back on that. Bart Ehrman says there are a bunch of New Testament texts from sermon summaries and early creeds that can be dated 1 to 2 years after the cross. James Dunn.
Yeah,
Do you
that's
think
false.
that it happened very early?
Ehrman doesn't say that, and he was explicitly asked about this one claim, like whether he really claims that the material is very early, like 1 to 2 years, and he says we have no way of knowing, which is of course true. And this is a like claim which is very often made by Christian apologists, but there is just no evidence. There is no evidence that would discriminate that kind of material originating 1 year after Jesus's resurrection, as opposed to later. Like there is a limit, like a temporal limit. So we can establish with like very high certainty what kinds of beliefs were formulated earlier than a certain point in time. And the limit is of course given by by specific texts that already discuss them, right? And they often discuss them with the implicit understanding that those beliefs have already been around for a substantive period of time, right? But prior to that, there's nothing that would allow us to precisify it more, right? So yeah, there are no reasons for thinking that it's like 1 year as opposed to later or earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. So what credence would you give to this?
I think it's really difficult to say, right? Because you would have to basically work out some kind of timeline, a chronology of events, probably only using the Pauline epistles, because I don't take the chronology, like internal chronology into Book of Acts, as historically reliable. Which, like, it could be describing events as they happened. We just don't know. It's underdetermined. So you would have to for example, establish when it is the case that Paul became a Christian, because that would give you a limit. You would, for example, establish that there were already Christians making claims prior to Paul conversions.
Okay.
Yeah, but it would be
So-
difficult to say, right? You would have to, for example, date the letter of Galatians to Galatians independently from the Book of Acts, because there Paul says that like 3 years after his conversion, he was preaching in Arabia, then he went to Jerusalem, then from after 14 years, he also met the people in Jerusalem. So you could like work backwards from that. But I don't know if it's possible to date the letter of Galatians to the Galatians independently from the Book of Acts, right? I think the dating of when the various letters was written is very uncertain, and it's based on just assuming that roughly the chronology of the various missionary journeys of Paul in the Book of Acts is historically correct, which I wouldn't be granting.
So should we put it down as 0.2?
Well, I think we should. So yeah, we should specify what early means, right? So let's say that.
How about within 5 years?
Okay, yeah. So within 5 years after Jesus' death, Christians were saying that he rose from the dead. In some sense. Yeah, let's just put it at like 0.5 for now, which means it's just as likely as not.
Let's put it at 0.52, okay? For an important reason, which we'll come back to later.
Oh, it tweaks it gets the numbers to where you want them to be, or?
Well, no. So it just let's have it be above 0.5.
Okay.
Because the point that I want to make is that like we can accept that each of these things is probably true, but the conjunction of them is unlikely. So we can agree with what Habermas claims is the historical consensus, and still, it's not.
Yeah,
But-
it's still more probable than not that at least one of those claims is false. It's what you're
Right.
saying. Yeah,
Yeah.
obviously, yeah. And it's really interesting because we can just abuse exactly what Habermas said in this very stream, because he gave the specific example of you having three claims which are all 0.8%, like they have that probability, and he used the what's the probability that at least one of them is going to be correct. Well, now we can actually flip it, right, and ask, what's the probability that at least one of these three facts is going to be false? What's the probability that both, 2 out of 3, any given 2 out of the 3 are going to be false? And what's the probability that all 3 are false, right? And when it comes to at least one, it's going to be higher than 0.5.
Yeah. Right. Let's.
Done as influential as any New Testament scholar says that Creed in 1 Corinthians 15:3 may have been dated by the end of the same year Jesus was crucified. That would give about 9 months for that thing to come about. So early.
Evidence.
Number 4.
Evidence. It might have been. Okay, everything is possible in the magical kingdom, but why 9 months as opposed to 15 or 27 or 72? Seriously, there are no arguments and there is no evidence.
But it might have been, Camille.
Yeah.
Turned the world upside down. To what extent? Well, I don't argue that we have to prove the disciples died as martyrs, but I do think that some of the key ones did. We have good first century data, and all.
Wait, okay, that's another minimal fact.
Yeah, this is a little bit tricky because he says at least one of the Jesus's disciples, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that the dying as martyrs has always struck me as a pretty crappy piece of evidence, because, even if they it seems likely that, if we're granting the other minimal facts, that they were convinced of the belief, even if it wasn't actually true. But second, even if they died for their beliefs, like if someone's accusing you of heresy, then saying that you're actually a fraud is not going to improve your chance of not dying. So it's absurd. So, but the probability that the disciples died as martyrs, that some of them did, I mean, I don't know. What odds would you give conditionalizing?
Yeah, I think this is really problematic because I think let's just say that no actual disciples of Jesus were martyred. I think it's still pretty probable that we would have the same kind of evidence for their martyrdom that we actually have. And it's just because, first of all, Jesus was martyred, right? And also, Christians were experiencing persecution, even if it was just really situational and not systematic. That's for example, in the second century, there were instances of Christian persecution, which means that Christians were interested in depicting the founders of the faith or the important initial figures of the faith as dying the same kind of way as Jesus did. And in some cases, this is made really explicit in the martyrological literature, that they are dying as the Lord did. And also, they would be interested in depicting them as dying in the same kind of way, because it's the kind of experiences that they themselves had, right? So it makes it more relevant. And a lot of the early accounts of the martyrdom in, for example, the Apocryphal Acts, you can see that it's a piece of literature where the plot is structured with these kinds of considerations in mind. It's supposed to be relevant for the readers in the second century to their experiences. It communicates specific theological messages. So it's not like a disinterested historical record of what actually happened to these people. So I don't think that just because, for example, in the Acts of Peter dies by martyrdom, that's like a really good historical evidence that he actually did, right? So I don't know, but It would be really interesting to to really answer the question how probable it is that these specific people were martyred, just given the evidence that we have available.
Yeah, so let's say that this is point.
We can put it at 0.52 as well.
Okay, let's put it at 0.5.
And this
I mean,
that is of course the independent discussion of, even if that did happen, does it move the probability of the resurrection happening? Which of course it doesn't, because as you pointed out, that just establishes at best that they really believe it. Now, what apologists want to say is that you are going to be more likely to really thoroughly investigate a claim before you are willing to be killed because of it, right? That basically people are more skeptical and they are more thorough investigators when it comes to belief that potentially put them in danger of losing their lives. But I think this is false, and we have obvious counterexamples to it. Like, suicide bombers in Islam are not the ones that are investigating the veracity of Islam the most vehemently, right? That's just not the case. Like that's the kind of thing that seems intuitive, but when you actually look at the empirical evidence, no. Like, people are extremely confident for extremely bad reasons, and they put almost zero effort in making sure that they are actually right before they go on and martyr themselves, right? And I think that Jesus' disciples were not in a position to know whether Jesus was actually raised from the dead or not.
Yeah. All right. So let's continue.
All the ones we know about were willing to die. Now you can say, well, how do you know? You can't read minds. I'm not reading minds.
Gary, how do you know? You can't read minds.
Yeah,
Look at that.
Who says that?
Continually go into the roughest places, and you continually get beat up, and you, like Paul, get stoned, and your followers think you're dead, and you keep going back to the same place. That means you're willing to die for that message. If the message stays the same, which in the New Testament is always minimum, factual side, minimum, deity, death, resurrection of Jesus, then and you're turned on by that. That's cool. The last two, 5 and 6, are the two skeptics. James is not established as well as Paul, but that James and Paul both have this characteristic. They both became Christians, as far as the vast, Paul for sure and James probably became Christians because of what they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. So that's it. Crucifixion.
Yeah, citation needed.
Very, very early. Turned the world.
What's the evidence that James, Jesus' brother, became a Christian because Jesus appeared to him, or that because he believed that Jesus appeared to him? That's not in evidence.
Yeah,
I would say I would say
one that would probably be like 0.95, right? Like, we know that Paul converted.
We don't know that Paul converted because he believed that he became convinced that Jesus appeared to him. Like, the Damascus Road experience is not narrated in any of the Pauline epistles. That's a later account by an anonymous author, possibly as much as 3 generations removed from the life of Paul. Very probably modeled after the conversion of Heliodorus, the foreign persecutor of the people of God in 2nd Maccabees, and the closest that Paul actually gets to describing the reasons why he was converted is in Galatians, and even there he doesn't say, I was converted to Christianity because Jesus appeared to me. And there are like multiple different explanations which have been proposed as to what made Paul doubt his initial belief that Christianity should be persecuted. Like, one really interesting proposal, which is of course entirely speculative, is that Paul's beliefs were really shook when he experienced Christians speaking in tongues. Because in the ancient world, speaking in tongues was very widely believed to be something that you can only do if you are possessed by the Holy Spirit. So if, like, when he saw Jesus actually, when he saw Christians doing that, like, that's something that would, I think, plausibly make him reconsider. And then he would actually start having conversations with Christians. He would have the theology explained to him. He would then go through the Septuagint, and then he would gradually become convinced that, holy shit, they are actually right. The Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible was actually talking about this guy all along.
But didn't I didn't I don't think he said that Paul and James had to have religious experiences for the minimal fact, just that they converted. Or
No, he
did
said explicitly that both James and Paul converted explicitly because they became convinced that Jesus appeared to them. That was the trigger.
I'd say for James, I'd be like 0.2, 0.3. I don't know. I mean, for James, we don't have good evidence for it.
I think we don't even have good evidence for the claim that he was initially skeptical, because the motif of skepticism of Jesus's own family is first attested in the Gospel of Mark, and there it's a part of a motif where the people who are closest to Jesus, like his family or his disciples, are the ones who don't actually believe him and don't understand him. And the further away you go, basically, out of that closest cycle, the more affirmation you get. So Jesus is accepted paradoxically by sinners, and the figures in the Gospels who know exactly who Jesus is are demons. So they are like the furthest away from the people who could be the closest to him. So that's a motif of reversal of expectation, which happens very, very often in the Gospel of Mark. It's like a literary feature of the Gospel of Mark, where the author is explicitly giving you the opposite of the information that you would expect. So given that this literary motif exists, it becomes really, really implausible that Jesus' own family was skeptical of him, because it fits this literary feature, it fits this literary trope, and actual history doesn't revolve in literary tropes. And what's also like a really strong evidence that this is not historical is the fact that neither the Gospel of Matthew nor the Gospel of Luke actually choose to copy this piece of information out of the Gospel of Mark, because they both have infancy narratives where they are interested in depicting Jesus's family being aware of who he is even before his birth, because angels appear to them, right? So both the author of the Gospel of Matthew and the author of the Gospel of Luke, they had a copy of the Gospel of Mark in front of them, and they read that Jesus' own family, including his mother and his brothers, who are named explicitly in the text, believed that he was crazy. They saw the line in the manuscript, and they both, probably independently, decided not to copy it into their own gospel, because it wouldn't make sense internally, right? Like, if you have angels appearing to Mary and Jesus, then why would they later think that he's nuts? Like, they know exactly who he's supposed to be. I don't think we can establish that Jesus' family was skeptical. Like, for all we know, they were just completely on board with it from the beginning. And this is just ahistorical.
So for Paul, should we say like 0.2?
So what's the probability that? Yeah, I would say that's.
Sorry. I meant for James. 0.2 or lower?
Yeah, let's just put it at 0.2.
And for Paul, I'd say like Paul, like 0.5.
Well, the specific claim is that a resurrection appearance of Jesus was the trigger. So you have to imagine, like, again, what Gary Habermas is imagining in his head is what's narrated in Acts, right? So that you have Paul running around persecuting Christians, putting them to death, and then suddenly he like falls on his knees because he starts seeing resurrected Jesus. I think that's overwhelmingly improbable. I think it's like very probable, unless you think that Paul is lying, which is also like more probable than the resurrection, right? But if you rule out that explanation, I think it's really probable that Paul had some kind of experiences which he interpreted as the Lord communicating with him in some way, right? He, for example, said that there was a guy he knew who had a vision of going to the third heaven. He probably means himself, but then that could be a dream, for example, like perfectly ordinary, natural dream. But you have to zoom in on the specific claim that some kind of experience was the trigger. And I think that's pretty, like, the probability of that is relatively low, right?
Okay, so for Paul, so let's interpret Habermas's claim very broadly, that Paul had some kind of experience that caused him to convert.
Yeah, I think if we put it at 0.2 for James, then I think like 0.3 to Paul for Paul.
Okay.
I think it's much more it's much more probable that the reasons for why Paul converted were different, and that he became convinced that the Lord is communicating with him later. And
Okay.
I think a communication of Jesus to Paul, like all that Paul could plausibly mean is that as he's reading through the scrolls of the Hebrew Bible, he comes to realize that the text has been talking about Jesus all along. Like that could be all he means when he says that the Lord is talking about to him, right? With an exception of a visit to the third heaven in a dream.
Yeah, okay, so now that we have the minimal facts, so let's see, which are the ones, so in order for the resurrection to be true, for Christianity to be true, the fourth one wouldn't have to be true, right? And the third one wouldn't have to be true. Like Christianity could be true, but it wouldn't have to be the case that they preached it that early. So we get 0.63, and for Christianity to be true, Jesus would have had to appear to Paul, right? Like that's like, I haven't read the book of Acts yet. I plan on doing so, but so I'm kind of out of my depth here a little bit. But so if Jesus didn't appear to Paul, then would that render Christianity false?
No, not at all. I think it would make Christianity more likely to be true. Because what reasons a priori are there to believe that Jesus would be interested in appearing to someone who isn't his disciple? Like if he appeared to Paul, why didn't he appear to Tiberius? And it's Jesus appearing to Tiberius to convert the Roman emperor is not improbable, because after all, Jesus appeared to Constantine 300 years later or so, and that led to his conversion, right? So yeah,
okay.
if
So-
like the fourth, if it was plausible that Jesus appeared to like the 40th Roman emperor in the line of succession, then why not to the second?
So based on these minimal facts, so 1 and 2 have to be true for Christianity to be true, that Jesus died by crucifixion and there were post-death appearances. And so like even the odds of those, and we're accepting that they're more probable than not, are this still leaves Christianity at like 1/3 less probable than it was prior to considering these facts. And this is being pretty conservative with these. So yeah. All right, let's continue. But I also like there seem to be very easy naturalistic accounts of these things.
Yeah, that's the important part, right? And I'm not just shitting on this. I actually have like hours and hours of content where I explicitly argue that there are like very reasonably fleshed out alternative or competing explanations of all of this, which are obviously much more historically probable than like a corpse having a conversation with his friends after 3 days.
Yeah, so here's the account, okay? Jesus dies by crucifixion, then his disciples are grief-stricken. Some of the people report images of Jesus. It becomes sort of like Jesus, when he appears to them, tells them about how he appears to his favorite disciples. So that causes them to like talk about how Jesus appears to the other disciples through cognitive biases and the desire to gain social prestige. Others claim to convert. Christianity begins to spread rapidly, leading to the conversion of James and Paul. Paul converts as a result of seeing people speaking in tongues. James converted like earlier. James converted at some point. And then the disciples died as martyrs because they couldn't have been saved. Like, I don't know. That's not a super well fleshed out account, but that's just way more probable than like that's just such an easy account of the minimal facts. Now we don't have to add the detail about them claiming that Jesus said he'd appear to his more zealous disciples. So we can just say that he appeared to some of them. That caused expectation. They thought that he would appear to others of them, leading to the conversion. Things spread rapidly. So
I don't think you need Christianity to spread rapidly. Like when I imagine the spread of Christianity, I imagine like a superglue spilling. You know, that's actually been considered. Like, how quickly do you need Christianity to spread to account for the evidence that we actually have in the text? And like, for example, if it's the case that a Christian community of 100 members in any given year got 2 or 3 net new converts, then that gets you to the numbers that you need to explain all of the evidence.
Oh,
and
wow. Okay.
2 or 3 net new people, you know, this you have to also take into account all the people who deconvert, die, are martyred, and stuff like that. That's not a rapid growth. That's actually a very slow, steady growth. Of course, if you take at face value where in the book of Acts says that thousands of Jews converted on the spot after like one speech, then you're going to have a difficulty explaining the data. But I don't take that at face value, right?
Right, and that's not a minimal fact that Habermas included.
But it's going to be exactly one of the things that Habermas is going to take for granted when you have subsequent information with him, a conversation with him. And this is the biggest weakness of the minimal facts apologetics. Like, it's designed to supposedly to argue for the resurrection only based on the facts that like Rudolf Bultmann would accept. But then when you have subsequent conversations, you quickly discover that what Gary Habermas means when he says that Jesus' followers were convinced that he appeared to them, he means the kind of experiences that are described in the canonical Gospels. And Rudolf Bultmann wouldn't say, oh yeah, I totally think that there was Thomas in the first century, who, if we talk to, would tell us, yeah, I believe that Jesus appeared to a group of people, and I like fingered his wounds, right? So yeah. They are smuggling things that like critical New Testament Christians don't agree on.
Yeah. All right, let's keep playing it, because we've gotten like 12 minutes into the main part and we've been going for like an hour. But that's okay. You know, this is modeled on the bad apologetic streams, which go like 10 hours. So
yeah, we can do part 2. That's fine.
Yeah.
I have a hard stop on the top of the hour, but I have probably the best justification for it. I'm going to fetch my newborn baby from the hospital and bring it home for the first time. So
okay, that is quite a good excuse.
Yeah, like, what could be better, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, no, that sounds cool. Yeah. Okay. Let's keep going.
Upside down, turn their lives upside down, James and Paul. I would use those facts. And let me just say, when I say 6 facts, I mean the data that confirm the facts. When I say data that confirm the facts, I'm talking about data the critics allow. I'm going to use their methods. So I'm going to use our
critics. I keep saying it, and you don't want me to say it. To quote Habermas in the Pine Creek conversation.
Arguments are, for the most part, a Bart Ehrman will allow. For the most part, Rudolf Bultmann will allow them. And we can use that data. If you're going to resurrect from that data, you're on the way in the right direction. So that's the argument.
You're on the road to Damascus.
Using the critics' facts to say you don't have a leg to stand on.
So let me give like a quick. Sorry, I was hearing a little echo there. Hopefully it's not going to be too much of a problem. So I was hearing 6 different facts that you gave. His crucifixion appearances proclaimed early. They turned the world upside down. James became a Christian after he had an appearance, and same thing for Paul. And what you're doing is you're saying that there's these 6 facts that are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus being resurrected from the dead. So the overall strategy here, and Mike, you have a lot of great analogies that you use in your work when you're giving like the basic overall structure of how an abductive argument works. Maybe we should do that. What's like a good analogy? I mean, in the medical field, when people,
I think we can skip
doctors-
this as well because they are basically just explaining what abductive reasoning is. So if you skip like 5 minutes, then we'll see.
What? You have an inference to the best explanation of the minimal fact?
Well, man, a bodybuilder helped that 2-year-old bench press. Well, then it becomes plausible. So the hypothesis that is most plausible is to be preferred. So these are the 4 most important criteria.
Explanatory scope, explanatory power.
But he botches the explanation of what plausibility means, or the example of what plausibility means, right? He says, for example, when you have a hypothesis that a 2-year-old bench pressed like 100 pounds, that's really implausible because like children can't do that, right? But if your hypothesis is that a professional bodybuilder like helped the kid to lift it up, then it becomes plausible. Well, that's not, and the reason why he chooses this specific example is that he can then draw an analogy and to say, well, it's not really plausible that Jesus was raised from the dead on naturalism, but if you assume that there's a God who raised Jesus from the dead, then that becomes really plausible, right? But of course, that's not what plausibility means. That just kicks the can down the road, because then you have to explain, you have to ask yourself how plausible it is that there would be a bodybuilder who would help the kid. If it's really implausible, like if it, for example, like happens in a society where there are no professional bodybuilders or something like that, that it's still really implausible. Or if we can like positively rule out by other evidence that no bodybuilder was present, then it's still implausible. And similarly, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, you have to ask questions like, okay, would Yahweh really intend to have the Messiah crucified and then raised from the dead? Like what reasons, independent from the actual evidence that we are discussing, are there to believe that Jesus would be that Yahweh would be the kind of deity who would have the intentions to do it? And I'm going to argue we don't have any reasons like that. The resurrection actually took place in an inappropriate religious milieu. Again, like Jews in the first century who were in the best position to evaluate what kind of things Yahweh would and wouldn't want to do, didn't expect this. So why should we think it happened? That Yahweh would want to do it?
Yeah, makes sense to me. Okay, Kamil, you've convinced me. I'm starting to think all this Jesus stuff isn't true.
Thing Gary said about the proof thing. And it's true that we could say the resurrection is not proven if we're talking defining proof as 100%. But I'd also be very quick to add that the same could be said about every ancient event. In fact, it could be said about every historical, because you could always come up with some sort of an alternate explanation.
We have more evidence for the resurrection than for Caesar crossing the Rubicon. I read one thing that I found funny was that Carrier devoted like a chapter of his book to responding to claims that were like, we have more evidence for Jesus than for X historical claim, where he would just like lay on the evidence for said historical claim.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way hard to argue for it, like because more often than not, those claims are false. Like we actually do have better historical evidence for the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which is one of the claims. We have better historical evidence for Alexander the Great, right? They often say, oh, the earliest biography of Alexander the Great was written hundreds of years later. Well, bitch, we have actual letters written by Alexander himself. That would be great if we had that for Jesus. And we don't just have manuscripts, like copies of copies. We actually have like first generation manuscripts. Like for example, there is an inscription on the island of Chios of a letter that Alexander wrote to the community. So it's what actually happened is that they sent the autograph, and then the inhabitants of the island created the inscription based on the autograph. So we have like a first generation manuscript. We have a copy of the original, which is not what we have with the New Testament. Very, very probably, right? We have letters that were sent to Alexander when he was a teenager, when he was like 15, right? So what are you talking about? But also the other way how you can argue against it is to say, okay, let's grant that the evidence for the Caesar crossing the Rubicon is like significantly worse, or for example, Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants is significantly worse than the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, what's the prior probability? Because it could be the case that it's principled to accept some claims, even though they have worse evidence than other claims, which we reject, because there's a difference in prior probability. Obviously.
Right. I mean, like, you know, if you have lots of reports of a person existing, well, if they're a like mascot for like a company, like the Wendy's woman or something, even if you had similar evidence for the Wendy's woman or for a random historical figure, I'd be more likely to believe in the random historical figure because because the reference class of company mascots, most of them don't exist as real historical figures. But the same is not true of like most historical figures with similar evidence. But yeah, I mean, the claim that we have more evidence for like, yeah, I mean, Carrier dedicated a book and he started a dedicated chapter of his book and he had like, I think really, really decisive evidence against the claim that we had more evidence for those things than for
like if it's possible to find claims in the like in the historical record that has like much worse historical evidence supporting it than the resurrection of Jesus. Like there are, for example, people who are first mentioned, people from the ancient world who are first mentioned in Suida, which is like 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia. So it could be the case that they are, for example, first mentioned more than a millennia after they actually lived. Fair enough, right? That's not comparable to the resurrection of Jesus. But those kinds of people are so obscure that just nobody gives a shit about whether they existed and what kind of lives they lived, right? They are extremely obscure, like historians, artists, poets, and stuff like that. So it wouldn't just be rhetorically very effective to use them in apologetics. You have to use Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Alexander the Great, and stuff like that. The crossing of the Rubicon. That's something that even people who went through the American educational system probably are vaguely aware of, even though they probably don't know what Rubicon is, and they couldn't point to it on a map.
Okay, I know it's like a lake or river of some kind.
Yeah, where is it on the map? Do you know? Can you get to Rome from France without crossing the Rubicon? Because Hannibal, for example, never crossed the Rubicon. That's a little known fact because you don't have to actually. Yeah.
Okay, this seems like a good time to play the next clip. Okay, to divert away from the tricky Rubicon questions.
So when we make decisions in life, we don't make decisions based on absolute certainty. We make it based on probability. So you may go to the grocery store in a day or two to get some food that you need, to restock up on some food. You do so and you think that you're going to come out safe and not get the coronavirus as a result. You do that because you think it's most probable that's going to happen.
Oh, okay. Wait, just to be clear, information that I definitely knew. So the Rubicon is a stream separating Rome from the province of Gaul.
Yeah.
Or even when this is all over.
I definitely did not Google that.
It's specifically Cisalpine Gaul, like so the Gaul that's in today's Italy, and the point is that like there isn't a river that is going to run through all of the Italian peninsula, right? Like there is a mountain range that goes through the peninsula, and of course there are rivers that either go on one side or the other. And it just happens to be the case that Caesar crossed on the side that the Rubicon is on. But for example, Hannibal crossed on the other side, so he didn't actually cross the Rubicon. And his brother either. Like, did you, for example, know that the Carthaginians crossed the Alps twice with an army? Like, that's something that nobody knows, almost. Everyone knows about Hannibal, right? But his brother actually brought a way bigger army across the Alps as well, and Romans had to fight with him as well. So at some point there were two brothers, in Italy fighting the Romans. And this is a really so again, like Lacona is now trying to basically say it's okay, fellow Christians, to be less than 100% certain about the resurrection, because this is just how history works, right? And it's really interesting that there are genuinely Christians, and they are not that rare, who are going to push against that. Like just the other day, I had a conversation with a Christian on Facebook, as you do, and he argued that, like, I was trying to tell him, look, like, history is about probabilities, and there are reasons to believe that the resurrection is just not very historically probable. And he came back saying, well, improbable events happened all the time. That's like a really shitty methodology. Like if you adopted that methodology consistently, then you would have to disbelieve everything that happened in history that's like inherently improbable. And I'm just thinking, okay, if that's the case, and if what this Christian is saying is correct, then we are done here. Because an atheist, a non-Christian, can just come up with any explanation other than the resurrection, and it doesn't matter how improbable it is, and he can just completely dismiss Habermas and Lacona by saying, well, improbable things happened all the time, so why not this?
Yeah. All right, let's... Yeah, I mean, the resurrection is just a terrible explanation of anything.
Somewhere you do so because based on the data that you have reasonable confidence, reasonable certainty that you're going to get there safely, and so you go. If we're waiting for 100% certainty before we go somewhere, we're going to spend the rest of our lives at home. So we're looking for reasonable certainty, not 100%.
I also wanted to mention that we're really just going to scratch the surface here, because Gary gave an overview of 6 different facts that as a result of his investigation, and you can give arguments and evidence for each one of these facts. And I don't know that we'll get a whole lot into it today in this episode. We're going to focus on questions and maybe some alternate explanations, why those fail, that kind of thing. But that is not to say that that's where the end of it is. So the whole point of me bringing up the books earlier in the show is that if you want more, if you want to go deeper, you want to hear some of the arguments, some of the evidence, why these skeptical scholars accept these facts, then head over and pick up the books, read the books. Don't just stop at a YouTube video where we're giving like a summary of the arguments and interacting with some questions. If you want to go deep and if you want to be serious about it, you've got to do the hard reading. You've got to do the hard work of taking it seriously.
Unless you went through all of the books, you are not justified in leaving the faith or not converting to it. You just have to engage with and it doesn't matter that they are publishing books faster than anyone can reasonably read them. You are never off the hook.
Yeah, no, as long as, unless you read all the books that were in Cameron's 150 plus arguments for the existence of God, unless you read every single source cited there, you're not justified in leaving.
Yeah, and like, so some listeners might think now that we are just being assholes, but you have to keep in mind that these kinds of people are going to tell on camera. You just have to read a book. You just have to write a book. When you write a book, that's how you gain credibility. That's how churches will start like inviting you for speeches. You have to have a book. So yeah, these people are essentially saying, they are volunteering the information that the reasons why these publications exist is because, like, shut the skeptics down, right? William Lane Craig said that when he was talking about why they are setting up the Institute of William Lane Craig. They are setting it up explicitly to provide the resources to shut the mouths of skeptics and doubting Christians, because then there are going to be an entire institute producing resources that Christians can point to and say, unless you spend literally decades sifting through all of that, you are not justified.
Unless and until you tear down all of the arguments that I've presented and erect in their place your own arguments for atheism. Unless and until that happens, I think we're justified in believing in Christian theism.
And so that's what I encourage you to do if you want to go deeper. But Mike, you said, well, Gary gave 6 facts. Do you agree? Would you give 6 as well? Or would you limit it to 3? Or would you add some? What's your case look like?
Depends what I feel like it at a particular day.
Depends how you feel like it.
Like
some people say 3, some people say 11. Like, shouldn't you give the facts that the New Testament scholars actually agree on? Like, I take this as a tacit admission that these guys don't actually have any hard evidence about how many New Testament scholars agree with which of these facts. because if they did, they would actually have a principled reason behind how many of these minimal facts there are. But he just says, I include whatever, depending on how I feel like it. And when you actually collect the different lists mentioned in the different debates and books, as I do, you find out that the number really fluctuates, like a lot. And one of the reasons for that is not only because different apologists are going to have different views on which facts are and are not relevant to the question of the resurrection of Jesus. One of the underlying reasons is that they are actually bluffing when they say that this is what the most New Testament scholars are going to agree on. They don't know. They didn't do the original research to determine that. It's just their guess. Or they are including facts based on like rhetorics and what's strategically advantageous.
The same way that, we might just get tired of a certain way and we want to just change things up. So the three that I gave in my doctoral dissertation, if I recall here, was, and in the big book, is Jesus died by crucifixion. Number two, shortly after his death, a number of his followers had experiences, like Gary said, they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus. And number three, a skeptic, a persecutor of the church named Paul, also had an experience he was convinced was an appearance of the risen Jesus, and he became a follower of Jesus as a result, had a transformed life. Now, those are virtually 100%. I mean, of course, you may have a few out there who deny that Jesus ever existed, but Richard Carrier, he's leading the charge in saying Jesus was a myth, and he's a bona fide historian, a professional historian. By the last count of which I was aware, he only gave 7, including himself, 7 bona fide scholars.
Some of those people have already died, by the way. I think what
some of them have died, but most
but
are
some
still
are
with
still
us.
alive. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I think
and five, and first Richard Carrier's book convinced the 500, some of whom are still alive today.
No, it's actually this is really sketchy because it matters a lot what exactly is the position of the people on the list when it comes to the historical existence of Jesus, right? Like whether it's the case that they, for example, say, yeah, it's possible that Jesus didn't exist, or like the confidence that we can have in Jesus' existence is much lower than what is normally like assumed by the scholars working in the field. I think for at least some of the reason people on the list, that's much closer to the kind of information they are trying to communicate. It's not the case that there are 7 professional working New Testament scholars or scholars in the relevant field who say, yeah, I do think that the epistemic credence, my epistemic credence in Jesus-ism is over 50%. That's not true. Right? And also, like, one of them has died. And as far as I know, like, he hasn't been taken out of the list.
Yeah.
By the way, I need to be really bad, so you can talk about career for like 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I'll go on my Carrier defense spree. No, I don't know. Yeah, so I don't know. I think that the conversion of Paul. So obviously Paul converted, and something happened to cause Paul to convert, but we don't know what happened to cause Paul to convert. So I think that, for the reasons that Kamil talked about earlier in the stream, we really can't be very confident in the conversion of Paul. We can be somewhat confident in the post-resurrection appearances, but I don't know. I mean, I think that the Richard Carrier thesis about Jesus' mythicism is decently compelling. I would probably believe it just based on my assessment of the evidence, but I don't believe, like, I would assign similar credence in it to Kamil, just based on sort of like, I'm not a PhD historian, and so I would just generally defer on such matters to people who know what they're talking about. But, based on what I think I could best defend in a debate, I think it would be that. Hey, Kamil. All right, let's keep playing it. Long time no see.
In the world who think that Jesus never existed or probably didn't exist. There are more people, more credentialed, bona fide scientists who believe our Earth, our universe, is 15,000 years old or less than there are bona fide scholars who think that Jesus never existed. So,
I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, and like the reason why there are, if it's true, the reason why this is true is because there is a infrastructure set up and founded by Christians to specifically peddle like a version of their religion. So it's not like there are disinterested, objective observers who get the who get the academic qualification, and then they dispassionately look at the evidence and they conclude like what is the case. So then, when you observe that there are actually more scholars who think that the Earth is young than there are scholars who think that Jesus didn't exist, it's because the case for mythicism is so much shittier than the case for young Earth creationism. No, like the reason why there are so many young Earth creationists is because of the Christian apologetic industrial complex, right? There isn't anything like that comparable when it comes to pushing Jesus mythicism. So that there is a sociological explanation for it. It's not explained by how good the evidence or arguments actually are. You know?
Right. And the other thing is that the number of people who have really looked at the issue is pretty small. And so, like, the number, like, the number who would be, like, on record staking out a view on whether or not Jesus was a myth, well, it's pretty small. And it's the percentage of those who have staked out a position who think that Jesus is a myth is much higher than in the younger creationist side.
Yeah, I mean it's true that like New Testament scholars don't read Carrier's book. That's just a fact, right? And the reason why they don't invest the time to read it is because they already think that the case for mythicism is really weak, so they don't feel they need to invest the time and energy into reading a book about it, which of course creates this like feedback loop, right? So if the scholars don't think it's worth reading, then they are not going to read and they are not going to have their mind changed. But luckily enough, it has happened several times in history that the state of the biblical scholarship is in this kind of position in terms of different hypotheses, and those different hypotheses nevertheless became the consensus, like the documentary hypothesis, for example. So there is hope for mythicism.
The what hypothesis?
The documentary hypothesis, the hypothesis that the Torah wasn't written by Moses and it's actually a composite of different sources.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so just because New Testament scholars don't engage with Jesus mythicism and don't read the book, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to become more popular in the academic community. It's not like a filter that's impossible to go through or get through, because it has historically been the case with different kinds of positions, which nevertheless still became mainstream. It would be really good if all the New Testament scholars took, I don't know, like a week to actually read through the book and formulate some kind of cogent response. It's really unfortunate that they don't do it. But after all, there's like so many books that are published all the time. And like New Testament scholars mostly read books about the one super specific subject that they are actively working on. But it's understandable that they don't do it.
Yeah.
When we talk about a consensus, a universal consensus of scholars, of course, we're not talking about 100%. We're talking about 99.999%. And you may not get there with James, but you get there with Paul, you get there on Jesus' death, you get there on the disciples had experiences. And so those are the ones that I used in the book. Afterward, I started to use some others. I started to throw in that they believe bodily resurrection. So I went away from the kind of method that I used in my book, which I think, builds a very strong case for the resurrection. But I just wanted to, I'm convinced, based on the research I did, that in the book, that Paul and the earliest Christians were proclaiming that Jesus rose bodily, physically from the dead. And I wanted to throw those arguments out there and see how the skeptics would respond. And I enjoyed doing it because I think the responses that they have given are all easily addressed. And I think we can raise the confidence that Jesus was raised bodily, physically from the dead. So a lot of times I just bring that into the scene. One other thing I'll throw in there is that more recently, just to make things real
Sorry, were you saying?
simple, I go back to the original argument that I gave.
Like if it's really the case. So first of all, he would contrast the physical resurrection and spiritual resurrection, which is like a false dichotomy, because people in the ancient world believe that spirits are physical, they are material, the idea that there is like a completely disembodied immaterial substance is very, very late in the ancient world. Like not even Plato, for example, believed that the soul is non-material. They usually believe that it's made out of a different kind of matter, like very refined form of matter. But yeah, that's not an issue. And of course, this is easily explainable because in the like Second Temple Jewish context, the resurrections of dead people were conceived to be physical. So it's not surprising that Paul and the earliest apostles and disciples believed that Jesus' resurrection was also physical. That's very easily explicable on their background religious beliefs. Like they didn't have to put fingers into Jesus's holes to become convinced that he has a physical body. No, they already believed that if Jesus was raised, then he was raised physical, because they believe that if people are raised, then they are raised physical.
All right.
Years ago, and I used the same kind of method that C.S. Lewis used with the Great Trilemma, which later became Lord Liar Lunatic. And I just started off with one fact that Gary says virtually 100% of scholars acknowledge, and that is that Jesus' disciples had experiences they proclaimed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Actually, I go even less than that. Jesus' disciples claimed he rose and appeared to them. And I established that. And I say, all right, he either appeared to them or he did not. If he did not, they either thought he did or they did not think he did. So it was either lie or hallucination or identical twin or something, and you rule all those out. Then you come over here and say, okay, he did appear to them. So
that's the important part, right? Or something. And he like this is the biggest weakness of the whole like resurrection apologetics. It's essentially these guys are arguing against straw man, and they are not really steelmanning the competing explanations. And when they do, occasionally they actually which is much more probable than the resurrection.
Wait, sorry. You cut out a little bit. I missed everything after the word straw man.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that these guys are not trying to steelman the competing explanations, and on the rare occasions that they do, like there are actually instances on record of Christian apologists on the fly trying to sketch out, like workshop, an alternative competing explanation to the resurrection. And when they actually put in even a minimal effort, they came out of it formulating an explanation which is, I think, much more obviously, much more probable than like a corpse walking around and talking to people, right? And so that's one thing. And the second thing is, what Lacona does in the book, he only goes through competing explanations which were proposed in peer-reviewed literature. And as I've already pointed out, non-Christians are not, or even Christians who don't think it's possible to establish the resurrection on the historical grounds, they don't spend their time writing books, sketching out competing explanations. So the few isolated examples of bona fide scholars proposing some kind of explanations are not a product of some kind of systematic research project where they would spend like years trying to work out as like the best alternative explanation that they could. It's usually just Giza Vermes or someone like that writing like a paragraph off the cuff about what kind of thing might have happened to explain where the belief in Jesus' resurrection came from. It's not very good because that's not the point, right? They are not trying to compete with professional Christian apologists who are paid to do this. They are just writing about something else, and they happened to include like a page or two about the origin of the resurrection belief, right? So that and the other thing that is extremely frustrating is that Christian apologists, when they dismiss these competing explanations, they very often dismiss them on the grounds that they lack explanatory power. And what they mean by it is that they are unable to account for all of the pieces of evidence. But a lot of these competing explanations are not designed to account for all of the pieces of evidence in the first place. They are only designed to account for some. So, for example, Lacona in the book rejects the hallucination hypothesis, among other things, because it cannot account for the empty tomb. But of course, it's not supposed to. So what he doesn't do, and what Christian apologists often don't do, is consider different combinations of these partial explanations that is each designed to explain a subset of the evidence. And when you actually start thinking about what is like a comprehensive explanation that could cover all of it, then you very quickly start arriving to competing explanations, which are actually pretty good and much, much more probable than an actual resurrection.
Yeah, in the last few minutes that we have, one question I'd have for you is like, if you were tasked with being a Christian apologist, which historical arguments do you think are best? Like, do you think that the argument about Paul and the appearance to the 500 is best, or more of the like undesigned coincidences stuff, or just the minimal facts approach?
I would just go for the Spider-Man argument. Like, I would just say, oh, look, there are these amazing historical details in the texts, which, like, I would try to make the case that unless the text was written by people who were actually around, it's very unlikely they would be aware of these historical details, right? So that would actually motivate the audience into thinking that, wow, like, these texts were actually produced by people who knew what they were talking about, which at least closes some of the competing explanations. And it basically leaves you with the possibility that either what they are writing actually happened and they were there, and that's why they recorded, or they will deliberately deceiving people by mixing actual historical information with things that they knew didn't happen. Basically, that's how probably I would go about it.
Yeah, you said you had to leave. Like,
my wife hasn't texted me yet, so I think we are good.
Okay.
Didn't die and they thought he did, or he actually did die and rose from the dead. And you can eliminate all these things through a nice logic tree, and the only option you're left with is that Jesus rose from the dead.
Let's get into some of the evidence for the appearances. What is like the top? Well, I want to say top three, but
this is really this is really
the
interesting. So this is how Christian apologetics always goes. They don't argue for their position; they argue against competing views, right? So they basically, this is with the moral argument, with the fine-tuning argument. They don't argue that it's probable that, I don't know, God exists or whatever. They say, oh, this scientific explanation is improbable. That scientific explanation is improbable. The Urey Miller experiment didn't recreate, like, I don't know, dogs and people or whatever. Therefore, the only explanation that's left standing is Christian theism. Okay, can I do that? Like, can I start eliminating various explanations, including the resurrection, so that the only explanation that's left standing is mine? Because I think I can eliminate the Christian explanation, the resurrection hypothesis, pretty easily. So I don't have to actually argue in favor of mine. I can just dismiss theirs, and by default, I win. Is it what we are going to do? Like, is it the game that we are going to play?
Experienced what they took to be the risen Jesus.
I'm going to say that the best single argument, and boy, you're going to have such unanimity here, even with scholars who don't believe the resurrection, is the creedal passage in 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following. I don't know. I don't work in other fields of New Testament. Maybe Mike has a response, but it may be the most commented on passage in the New Testament, at least in apologetic terms. And there, Paul starts by saying in verse 3, I delivered unto you that which also received. Now, I mean, a scholar like Pinchas Lapid, who's a non-Christian Jewish scholar with a PhD in New Testament from a major German university. He passed away, but I mean, when he wrote a book in the early 80s, The Resurrection of Jesus, a Jewish perspective.
Some are still standing.
He gives, I believe, 10 linguistic arguments for this being an early creed. And most people just yawn. Most scholars would just yawn while you're doing it because this material is so well known. And I could give you a list of scholars, beginning with Reginald Fuller, way back in 1979, come up to the present. You've got Richard Bauckham, you've got James D.G. Dunn, you've got a guy named Ware in Indiana. These guys would tell you that the consensus New Testament view now, consensus, is that this material is pre-Pauline. There's two kinds of pre-Pauline. Before Paul was converted, this thing was in existence. And sometime after Paul's conversion, before 1 Thessalonians, often dated the earliest book of the New Testament. The second sense of pre-Pauline is there before 1 Thessalonians was written. Okay, or the other epistles. But they generally say, even the Jesus Seminar, which reject up to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus, tell you that the majority of their voters said this is pre-conversion of Paul. So it dates from 2 to 3 years after the cross. And it's
that's a massive leap in logic, right? This is what I was talking about. So he constantly conflates the idea that the creed existed before Paul first visited the church of Corinth and before he first visited Corinth and established a church there, with the creed was there 1 or 2 or 3 years after the crucifixion. Like, this is completely irrelevant, of course, when it comes to the probability of Jesus' resurrection, but it just bugs me as someone who like studies ancient history professionally, because that just doesn't follow. Like, even if you grant that the material that Paul recites was in circulation before he visited Corinth, like that doesn't specify enough to tell you how soon after Jesus' crucifixion it originated. It only gives you the latest possible date, but you can't then discriminate within that time period. There are no arguments for thinking that it's within a year or 2 or 3. And also I yawn at it as well, because it's completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Every competing explanation is going to be able to account for it.
Post crucifixion, obviously. You've got James Dunn saying maybe the same year. You've got other guys saying 30 AD. You got Bergerman giving a list from 1 to 2 years later. Extremely early. Yeah, they just yawn while you're doing it, seriously, because they're just going to grant it. And the minimal part of the creed, different views on how.
I'm yawning while he's doing it. That's because it's fun.
Yeah, and like the people who he cites, like Dan or Ehrman, either don't actually make the claims that he makes, because Ehrman was asked about this specifically, and he said, no, I don't make this claim. Or they present it as a possibility, but they don't actually think there's any evidence or arguments that would be able to establish it as like more probable than a different date.
Yeah.
How far the creed goes. But the minimal view is that verses 3 to 5, Paul states it, and then he gives the beginning. And in that beginning, the lowest common denominator is a group appearance to the 12. And the rest of the creed, there's 2 more appearances. To a group called all the apostles, which is bigger than the 12, and a group called 500 brethren. Now, what you take the word brethren to me, if brethren for Paul means you guys, or you all, then maybe there's 500 there. If this means men alone, as it sometimes means in the New Testament, there could have been 1,000 or 1,100, 1,200 people there, like on a mountainside, which is suggested. So we have 3 group appearances, one very large by any count, and their group appearances confirmed pre-Pauline. Barterman says Paul probably got it in Jerusalem from James and Peter, and he probably got all he could have. Berman says could have gotten all of his creeds in Jerusalem from before he was converted.
Could have.
That's how early it is. I would go with that passage right now. And if you said, well,
that's the point. It's possible that he got these creeds from when he visited Jerusalem and he met with Peter and James. But it's also equally likely that he first heard of the creed a week before he visited Corinth. Like, it's underdetermined, right? It's equally probable given all of the data that we have. When Ehrman talks about it, he just talks about what are the possibilities. But again, like, this is completely irrelevant, right? That's just me, like, spuzzing about ancient history and being like a nerd. Doesn't matter.
I'm getting kind of tired, so I would be interested in wrapping up soon, but we should definitely do a part 2.
Okay.
Do we want to play like 2 more minutes?
Which translates into like 20 minutes of me ranting. Are you sure? I don't know. Let's come to like a natural stop, and then we'll see in terms of what they're saying, right?
I would say the best attested appearance we have is the appearance of the 12. The appearance of the 12. But you know, I will tell you, I've got a friend who surveys very, very skeptical scholars and copies their responses. And he asks one question. He asks. He's sent me over 1,000 emails from these guys, and he quotes them. At least claims to quote them. Okay, and he asks them, "What do you guys think about the appearance of the 500?" And I am surprised. Many Jesus seminar guys go, "Yeah, I can't believe in hallucinations because the appearance of the 500 does it for me." And I'm going, "How gullible are you guys? Come on, be stricter than that. Be tough. Go with the 12. See what you. So I would take absolutely 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. Paul adds his appearance in verse 8, but 3 through 7 with 3 appearances to groups, unquestionably the strongest data on the appearance narratives in the New Testament.
Here's why this is so important. Is once you accept that there were these appearances.
Yeah, but so, I mean, even if there was an appearance, it's not clear that it was like a material bodily appearance. So it could have been like they saw like a Jesus-shaped cloud, you know. That
Yeah, this
given
is, this is my argument from pareidolia, right? Which
Yeah, I
actually
mean,
has a really good historical support when it comes to plausibility.
we don't have any first-hand accounts of what they saw. We just have Paul talking about what he thinks they saw. It's also possible.
Or they just use the word horo to explain like purely intermental phenomena they just shared within like a communal religious setting. Like when Pentecostals go through their like crazy religious experiences and they feel that Jesus was present, I think that's it's entirely plausible and much more probable that something like that happened, and it just happens to be the case that in Greek the word horo has a semantic range which is wide enough to be applicable to that kind of experience, and we can actually establish it. Like the specific verb that's used in 1 Corinthians 15 when it says that Jesus will appear to more than 500 brethren at the same time is ofthe, which is a form of horo. Horo means to see with your eyes, but that's not the only meaning. It can also describe purely intermental phenomena where no actual visual stimulus is present. For example, Philo uses it when he talks about his epistemology and how he knows various things about God. It's used in the Septuagint for various visions where no actual objectively existing phenomena would be observable by like other people, even if you take them for granted. So yeah, like I think it's much more probable that this is what explains what Paul is saying than them actually seeing the resurrected Jesus. But what Gary Habermas is imagining when he reads 1 Corinthians 15 and he reads that Jesus appeared to more than 500 brethren, he's imagining the Pentecostal 40-day persistent, physical, visual, auditory Jesus living among his disciples and like teaching them. This is what I'm saying, that they start with the fact that an overwhelming majority of New Testament scholars agree, but then when they go into detail and they start unpacking it, they start sneaking in, smuggling in views that almost no New Testament scholar is going to agree with. Only not even like Christian New Testament scholars by far, only Christian evangelical scholars who think that who have like their Westminster Confessions of Faith and stuff like that. Yeah.
So I mean, and the other thing, a point that's been made by Richard Carrier, is the appearance to the 500 could have been a mistranslation. So 500 is very similar to the word in, I think, Greek on the Pentecost, which was describing the day in which it happened. And so they could be talking about the time at which the event happened rather than the number of people, and it could be a scribal error. And I mean, scribal errors generally seem more plausible than magic.
Yeah, like I haven't read that passage for a while, so I would have to like understand how exactly that argument is like works, like what his reasoning is. But for example, Price thinks that the whole thing is interpolated. And that also explains, for example, all of the philological features that make it different from the Pauline letters, right? Like the reason why New Testament scholars think that this isn't original to Paul, that he's actually quoting a different material, is because for example, it uses some of the vocabulary that Paul otherwise doesn't use. And these are like standard indications of intertextuality. And here they work in cumulation. So there are like multiple different reasons for thinking that he is like reciting something that was already in circulation, and he didn't invent it the way how he's like inventing sentences in the rest of the epistle, right? But all of those arguments work equally well for the idea that this is a later interpolation, that it wasn't actually in the letter in the first place. And there are some like independent arguments for it, Like for example, the Creed is not cited by early Christian authors in their works in situations where they would obviously cite it if they were aware of it. But again, like, you don't have to defend. This is not the hill to die on. Like, there are very many different kinds of explanations, even phenomena that have external existence that multiple people can see at the same time, that can account for these kinds of texts and their content, unless you presuppose that if there is the Emerald Castle, there also must have been the Yarrow Brick Road, and you presuppose that when it says Jesus appeared to 500 people, it is describing Jesus eating, touching people touching him, and stuff like that for days and days.
Yeah. All right.
Let's stop here.
All right. Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. Thanks so much for watching, everyone.
How are we? Or should we talk about it offline? Like, when do you want to? Because you are in the Pacific Daylight, right? Time zone. Yeah. So that's not going to work. So maybe next weekend.
Yeah. Let's figure out a time some other time.
All right. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Check out my channel. I'll do you know, like, what the channel is? Because it's not the one that I usually comment from. It's a different one. So if you put it into the description.
If you send me the link on Discord, I'll add it to the like wow, my brain is just completely nuked. Description, yes, that's what it's called. All right, cool. Thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks for doing this, Kamil.
Thank you.
Talk later. Bye.